So without further ado, let me welcome you all back to this program. And I'd like to welcome Vishal Hariprasad, NIPESOL Managing Director and CESA board member, who is our next facilitator. He is a business leader with a background in civil engineering. He's currently the regional manager of NIPESOL Africa, as well as the managing director and chairman of NIPESOL Pty Limited, a global engineering and project management consultancy based in Johannesburg, South Africa. We are indeed honored to have him as a board member at CESA. Welcome to you, Vishal, and thank you for joining us today. So please, if you don't mind, you may assume your role as the facilitator for the next session. Welcome, Vishal.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for that introduction. Good day, all, and welcome to this midday session of the 2021 CESA Infrastructure Indaba. As Chris has indicated, I am Vishal Hariprasad, and I'll be facilitating the session today. And the title of the session today is Infrastructure Investment and Development, Key and Critical Issue in the current status. Joining me this session are a panel of esteemed speakers. We have Mr. Johan Lubbe, Mrs. Lulu Kruger, and Mr. Engelbert Benedel. I will be introducing them individually as I call them up to enlighten us today during the session. We will take 2 questions at the end of the first speaker slot due to time constraints, but we will also have a Q&A session at the end of the balance of the speaker presentations today. But before I hand over to the first speaker, I'd like to set the scene for the discussion. It's commonly understood that investments into infrastructure have a significant multiplier effect on economic growth and job creation. However, over the past decade, infrastructure spending as a percentage of GDP has continued to decrease both globally and more especially within South Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic of the past year and a half has significantly affected the South African economy, and it is now more than ever important that infrastructure development and investment is placed at the center of the country's economic recovery and growth. With an alarming overall unemployment rate of 32.6% as at the end of Q1 as reported by StatsSA, with this being even worse at 46.3% amongst those who fall into the range of 15 to 34 years of age, it's also imperative that job opportunities are created on scale, which infrastructure development has the potential to do in a relatively short space of time. With a significant portion of South Africans still struggling to get access to basic services such as water supply, sanitation, healthcare, transportation, security of power supply still remaining a challenge for industries and businesses, and the litany of reports about the poor state of infrastructure in the country, real investment into infrastructure and development is critical. However, there are significant challenges that stand in the way of being able to unlock these investments effectively. These range from access to funding and financing, global dynamics and demand, regulation and procurement, as well as corruption and maladministration. It is important that we unpack these challenges and understand how we can get the infrastructure ball rolling. On that note, I would like to introduce our first speaker this morning. Mr. Johan Lubbe is a disruption specialist in the innovation team at the Development Bank of South Africa. Here, he is responsible for the identification, conceptualization, design, and development of innovative financial products, instruments, and programs aimed at addressing some of the infrastructure delivery and financing challenges in the water, energy, transportation, social, and ICT sectors. Besides his passion for new product development, project preparation, and creating bankable projects, he has a number of special interests and experience in the water sector, where he's currently working on a number of innovative funding solutions and programs. Johan is a professional engineer and has been involved in the planning, preparation, and development of various large-scale infrastructure projects. Johan has a thorough understanding of the project finance, Triple P, and municipal environments, and has gained valuable experience in the financial and legal aspects related to the structuring, financing, preparation, and bankability of infrastructure projects. Johan holds a civil engineering degree from the University of Pretoria, a BCom law degree from UNISA, and a master's degree in development finance from the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Welcome, Johan, and hand over to you now to enlighten us with your presentation. Over to you, Johan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vishal, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation to talk to you guys today. I think what I wanted to share with you today is just around some of the programs and initiatives that's being worked on at the moment. There's, Kaz mentioned earlier, infrastructure South Africa, and there's really a lot of things happening in the infrastructure space at the moment. They may not all sort of reap results and impact immediately, but at least I think there's some positive aspects. And I'd like to share with you some of the programs and initiatives that we are working on at the moment. Some of you might have already seen them or are aware of them, but maybe I can just provide an update on some of them. We can go to the next slide, please. So I'll just want to quickly introduce, some of the principles and the approach that we're following, sort of trying to get to a programmatic approach around infrastructure development, infrastructure delivery, look at some of the programmatic and blended finance approaches, and then take you through some of the programs that we are working on. Go to the next slide. So just to touch on some of the principles that we are working on is we're trying to structure many of these programs as national programs. I think we learned a lot from the REAP program, the Renewable Energy Program, trying to build in some of those successes within other sectors and other subsectors within the country. But I think the national, creating these as national programs do mean a lot, and they do get a lot of support then. So, we're trying to do that, obviously linking with the infrastructure fund, which has recently been established. Very strong focus on how we can involve the private sector. I think government has recognized that they cannot do this alone. So we have to reach out to the private sector, not only from a funding perspective, but also from an implementation perspective, capacity support, design, operation and maintenance support. And the operation and maintenance element is extremely important. We cannot create assets and then just allow them to deteriorate again because we are neglecting from an operation and maintenance perspective. So we're bringing all of these elements in to try and come up with sustainable programs. Next slide, please. Next one. So just sort of, if we look at the REAP program, there were sort of two key success factors for us in that program. The first one is we created sort of a center of excellence when it came to renewable energy projects. So, the IPP office was established, and that created almost that one-stop space where if one had to or wanted to do a renewable energy project, that's where you went. So we want to create a similar center of excellence, maybe through a program management office in other spaces and other sectors and subsectors within the infrastructure environment. And then secondly, we had there were very specific funding solutions to implement projects. And we know that, money isn't always the problem. There's a lot of money available for infrastructure, but we do perhaps need some alternative options in terms of how we can finance infrastructure. We know the constraints that many municipalities are facing to raise funding on their balance sheets. So we are introducing or working on a number of alternative options. And hopefully that, these two key components can move us towards some of the implementation side of these projects. Next slide, please. So just some of the, within the Center of Excellence or this Program Management Office that we are working on a number of these programs, is really to create that space where we can centralize expertise, we can assist project owners with preparation of their projects, potentially procure from this national perspective. A very important point is the standardization. So we saw what happened in the REAP program again when we started standardizing approaches. We want to mirror that and bring that into some of the programs that we are working on. And we see that, resulting in us being able to do things quicker and also at a reduced cost. And specifically touching on the consulting engineering space is if consultants, if there's a different terms of reference for feasibility studies going out every time, it makes it very difficult to respond. It makes it very costly to respond. But if we have a standardized approach, then hopefully we can build on those efficiencies. Next slide, please. The second element is really looking at blended finance, and blended finance is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. I think traditionally it has been done, maybe not as visible as we are looking at it now, but it's really trying to see how we can bring and catalyze private sector investment into this space of infrastructure, using government funding, using credit enhancement from DFIs in a more innovative way so that we can crowd in private sector investment. And again, the funding isn't always the problem. We often sit with the challenge of having well-structured bankable projects, but we want to bring this element in and see how we can also support government, because traditionally government has been sort of sole funder of these projects, and we know that that's not possible. So we want to reduce the government contribution, for the government to come in maybe on a gap basis to fill the gap, but the primary funding coming from the private sector and from DFIs. Next slide, please. Next one. So just to take you through some of the initiatives that we are working on at the moment, colleagues, the first one is we're putting together a national non-revenue water program. We know non-revenue water is a huge problem in municipalities. We're losing a lot of water, not only physically, but also revenue losses. So again, trying to structure this as a national program, putting something together that we can really have a standardized approach, be able to accelerate and fast track the implementation of these projects. You can go to the next slide. Part of the structures that we are working on is also on performance-based contracting models. So this has been very successful internationally. Yes, we have tested it in South Africa in a couple of instances, but we really want to bring this in as a customized solution where we can look at the private sector and say, bring your expertise, bring your funding, and let us assist municipalities to reduce their non-revenue water. It's not always possible for municipalities to raise the funding on their balance sheet, so we want to look at different models, and then to also bring in some credit enhancement, some blended finance. You can see there on the right-hand side, bringing in partial credit guarantees to senior lenders, have the subordinated or the credit enhancement tranches, and then hopefully that would enable us to roll this out at a larger scale. The next program we're working on is around water reuse. You can go to the next slide, please. South Africa being a water scarce country, I think we are losing a lot of water down our rivers and into the ocean, especially at our coastal cities. And we need to start looking at how we can extract maximum value from that resource, not only from the water side, but we've got the opportunity to generate energy. We've got the opportunity to look at sludge beneficiation. And within that framework, this program is looking at to see how we can support municipalities to start scaling the preparation and implementation of their water reuse projects. We have started to see a lot of municipalities look at this. And we're also looking at a financing solution that can support this. If you go to the next slide, Jacques, please. We're working on a submission to the Green Climate Fund. It's an international body that's got very concessional funding that can be used for climate resilient and adaptation projects. And with South Africa being very vulnerable to climate change, we hope that we can be successful with this application. We are looking at getting sort of a pot of funding from the GCF that comprises both grants, concessional loans, as well as guarantee facilities that we can then use on a selective basis for projects, water reuse projects that do require that concessional funding as part of a blended finance solution. The next slide, please. Another initiative that we are working on, colleagues, is a private sector participation model, PSP model for short. We know that many of our municipalities do not have the ability to raise funding on the balance sheet. They also have got very little revenue generating opportunities. There's many times indigent populations working there, but it doesn't take away of that they've got a need. And we've seen that specifically also in the water and sanitation space. Our wastewater treatment works in many rural areas are really in a bad state. And if we want to invest, we have to come up with a different model here. Triple P won't work there, or municipalities, as I mentioned, cannot raise the funding from their balance sheets. So the private sector participation model is a model that we are working on. You can go to the next slide to try and see how we can leverage future grant funding. We know the grants do flow to municipalities on a regular basis, on an annual basis. Can we do more if we have a longer term view? We know we only have the MTF 3-year cycle, but if we can take a longer view, 10 or a 15-year view, we could potentially raise the funding up front, invest in those projects, make sure that the projects are there and providing benefit, and then recover over a longer period of time. So there's a lot of work going into that, and we're currently looking at a couple of potential projects to pilot this model. The next slide, please. If one then looks at property development, colleagues, we know that the private sector is there and ready. The developers are there, even government as a developer of subsidized housing. They've got money to do the internal services, build the top structures, but the bulk infrastructure is the responsibility of municipalities, and that's often where these projects are stuck, because the municipalities cannot provide that bulk infrastructure required to unlock and enable these property developments from happening. You can go to the next slide. So what we are working on here is a mechanism to try and see if we can support municipalities to provide that bulk infrastructure. It will lead to a lot of economic development, social development, housing development. There are some revenues that we can associate with these property developments, being development contributions payable by the developers, looking at grants coming through from government, and then also accessing potential property rights revenues that is being unlocked and generated by these developments. So the idea is that we invest or make funding available, provide the infrastructure, and then recover through accessing the sources of revenue. We're trying to structure this not as a loan to a municipality, but in a different manner, because we know very few municipalities, even at the metro level, can really accommodate these types of investments on their balance sheet. And then for us to provide a basket of services that is required to unlock these property developments. And again, having done a lot of work on this, we are looking at potentially piloting 1 or 2 of these projects fairly soon. The next slide, please. I'm just going to quickly go to this one. We're also working with the DMRE now on putting a program together around the approach to distribution asset management, or ADAM as an acronym. There's been a lot of work that's been done previously. We hope to be able to bring this forward and again come up with a programmatic approach and really address the energy space, look at asset management or maintenance, look at strengthening of networks and refurbishment, but coming up with innovative and blended finance solutions that we can enhance the structuring. You can go to the next slide. I think we can skip that one. Next one, please. Another initiative we're working on, colleagues, is around provincial roads. We know the very bad state that our provincial roads are in. Again, here we want to see, can we come up with an alternative approach, an alternative solution where we can potentially get the private sector, the construction involved, award them with a long-term concession. It's not on a PPP basis, it's slightly different, but then also leverage future grant funding that we know flow to the provinces, and we can then potentially bring the roads up to a certain level of service and maintain them for a period of time at that level of service, with the private sector being responsible for the performance and output on those road projects. You can go to the next slide. We can skip that one and then just the next one, please. I'll very quickly touch on this, colleagues. We also working on a mechanism to try and get municipalities to access the debt capital markets, the municipalities that can and that are able to borrow. So typically in this category would be your intermediate city municipalities. On an individual basis, they may not be able to get funding at very competitive rates, but if we group a number of the similar performing municipalities together, they can potentially, through a rated and a listed product, be able to get to raise funding in a much more competitive manner. The next one, please. This is the last two that I'll just touch on. Yeah, so the off-grid sanitation, I think a huge opportunity for us in South Africa. One, we don't have water to flush away in our sanitation system, so waterborne sanitation isn't always feasible. Secondly, we know in our rural areas it becomes very expensive to put in conventional waterborne sanitation systems. But with the new toilet technology, the new off-grid sanitation technology is becoming more and more technically suitable and viable. I think it poses a huge opportunity, and the level of service is just much better than what we are used to in terms of VIPs and so on. So there's a huge opportunity here, and I think we're trying to see how we can again come up with a funding solution that can support the scaled rollout of a non-sewage sanitation. And then the last one is around rural water supply. You can go to the next slide. So here we know there's a lot of communities that are sitting without water, or their water quality is very poor. We know municipalities cannot get to them in time to provide services. So if we can come up with a solution that almost these communities take control of their own destiny and solution themselves, what we're looking at here is sort of franchising, social franchising models, or models where we can get community-based enterprises going. They can provide the service to their community members. Again, the technical solution here is not the difficult one. We've got point of use systems available. We can treat centrally, but the funding is the challenge, and that's where we're trying to bring in a new solution and hoping to again test and pilot this in one or two areas within the country. Vishal, thank you very much. I hope I didn't rush too much, but just a quick overview of some of the programs we're working on, and hopefully we can create a strong pipeline of infrastructure projects that the whole country can benefit from in terms of improved service delivery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you for that insightful presentation and the detail as well. I think there's a lot of information to unpack there, of course, but it does sound like there's a lot of initiatives underway to try and solve the financing and funding challenge of unlocking infrastructure, especially in the municipal and public sector space. Johan, as you have to leave a bit early, just a couple of questions that have been posed. A lot of what you've just described relate to implementation of projects. Do the funding mechanisms available within the DBSA also cover project preparation costs for the preparation of these projects? And perhaps you'd like to just enlighten the audience a little bit on some of those details. And the second question I'd like you just to touch on is, DBSA, of course, would be receiving a number of funding applications on a regular basis and would be evaluating them. And there would be a couple of commonalities that would lead to rejection that you would be aware of. Perhaps you'd like to share some of that with the audience, so they'll find that quite useful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vishal. So just on the first one, I think creating a strong pipeline of projects is the most important thing that you can do. You can design the most sexy financing structures and innovative financing structures, but if there's not a pipeline of projects, then they're worth nothing. So you have to look at and what we're trying to bring into these programs. And you would have seen one of the slides talks about project preparation. So it's really to assist the project owners to prepare well-structured, bankable projects. It is one of the most difficult things, and it's traditionally we have struggled with that. And I've mentioned it earlier, but it's a controversial statement. But money isn't the problem. We've got lots and lots of money in the investment space to invest in infrastructure. Our problem is bankable projects. So we have to focus there, and the DBSA do have some project preparation funding available. We cannot prepare all the infrastructure projects in the country. It's just not possible with our resources, but there's a number of resources, institutions available, other DFIs, the South African government. We're working closely with CESA to really see how we can mobilize funding to do the preparation on these projects. And then, I think traditionally the bank has established a dedicated project preparation division a couple of years ago in response to, poor quality of submissions coming in. We often see projects well structured from a technical perspective, but it's severely lacking from a financing, a financial structuring, legal perspective. That institutional solution is often lacking. And I think that is something that we need to, and that the bankability aspects is looking into, to say, how do we enhance our submissions, our prepared projects, our bankable projects, so that they address all the different elements. Engineers, and I'm an engineer myself, so I'm not bashing engineers, but engineers loves doing the technical work. But we have to, that's often the easy part. The difficult part comes in structuring the projects, getting the financial solutions, and it becomes very difficult when you start looking at social projects, economic projects. Renewable energy projects is often the more easier ones to do. So those are some of the elements. And I think that we need to address, and hopefully, one can prepare and start preparing more bankable pipeline of projects.
Thank you, Johan. I believe then that the contact details or information around the Development Bank's project preparation division is available on the website, and that further information can be obtained from that source. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. And Johan, I think you've touched on it, but the challenges in getting grants or funding approved from the applications received, you've highlighted the fact that the technical part of the submissions are normally pretty good. It's the financial modeling and the financial side that falls down. Is that the main sort of reason that you guys see from the bank side that leads to some of these applications not being passed through?
Yeah, Vishal, I think bankability goes is all about risk. So what risk do you have in your project? What risks do you need to mitigate? We often mitigate the technical risks, through designs and so on. But one of the key things is if you want to invest in a project, you want your money back. You want a return. And here we're talking about not grant funding. It's easy to fund a project through grants, but we know we don't have the grants. So we have to start looking at debt. Debt has to be repaid. So you have to show, where's your repayment going to come from? Where's your revenue stream going to come from? So if you talk about a water reuse project, for example, are you going to sell water? To who are you going to sell that water? What's the risk of you not getting that water, that revenue in? So all of those things needs to be addressed, that the risk associated with those needs to be addressed. And those are, some of the elements that I think is important to focus on. The riskier a project, the more difficult it is to finance that project.
Understood. Johan, thank you. There have been one or two questions that have come from the audience. If I can just run through them quickly. The first one relates to combating climate change. And the question around that is there's funding within the bank that prioritizes projects that combats climate change?
Yes, Michelle. So we within our project preparation division, we've got a climate and environmental finance unit. The DBSA is also an accredited entity to the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, as well the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility. So there is a lot of climate finance available. Again, it comes back to structuring, to properly demonstrating, what that funding would be used for. Many of these institutions, international institutions, have got very strict requirements and criteria to make sure that their money goes into, climate benefits and so on. But the bank do have a dedicated unit, a team that is looking at that. And for example, on the water reuse program we're working on now is to be able to access some of that funding and ensure that we can bring them in, and again, looking at it from a programmatic approach rather from a project by project approach. So, putting a program together for South Africa that will have these elements of climate finance in them to be able to demonstrate and ensure that we address some of the challenges that we are facing.
Okay, excellent. Johan, last question before we let you go. You mentioned Provincial Road Initiative programs, and you indicated it would not involve a triple P, but a type of concession. Does this mean the tolling of provincial roads?
Yeah, that's a good one, Michelle. I think tolling is, there's a couple of revenue streams, or very limited revenue streams when it comes to roads. The most common one is tolling, but we know it will probably not work in a provincial setting. So we're looking at it slightly different there to say, can we leverage future grant funding? Again, the grants for infrastructure for roads goes to the provinces on a regular basis. So what we are saying is, if we have a 10-year or a 20-year site of a portion of those grants, we can effectively raise the funding up front, bring the roads to a certain required level of service, and then maintain them there, but then recovering over a 10 or a 15-year period by utilizing a portion of grants. There's other mechanisms. If we can get private sector, mining companies to invest some of their social labor plan money and CSI money into that, those are some of the options that I think we have available. But we can make a bigger impact if we can bring the roads up to a certain level of service immediately and maintain them there, than trying to do sort of piecemeal and drips and drabs by utilizing the grants as and when they become available in future years. So it's just that sort of a different type of way of looking at it. It's not generating new sources of revenue, but just trying to use the existing sources in a more effective and efficient way.
Wonderful. Johan, thank you so much for your time and your contributions this morning. Really appreciate it. And good luck. We'll take your
thanks,
chat.
Michelle, and all the best for the rest of the Indaba, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Johan. Okay, we will now move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mrs. Lulu Kruger. Lulu Kruger is a partner and the chief economist at PwC South Africa. Lulu has 20 years of experience as an economist, the majority of it within the consulting environment. She has also spent some time in lecturing economics at the University of Johannesburg and the Northwest University's Potchefstroom campus. She is a regular commentator in the media on economic matters and economic developments, and she also presents at national and international conferences. Lulu and her team focuses primarily to help clients understand how to make their businesses future-proof and sustainable within the local and future economic climate. They consider external factors that impact on the environment in which their clients operate, but also how clients' impacts on the communities, environment, and the economy of the areas where they operate. Lulu holds a master's degree in economics and risk management and postgraduate certificates in energy law and competition law. Welcome, Lulu, and I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I am just calling up some slides very quickly, if you would forgive me. Let me just see if I did this correctly. No. There we go. Just want to check. Can you see my slides? Michelle?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. So yeah, what an interesting conversation as well. I think what we need at the moment in South Africa is innovative thinking about how we address some of the challenges that we have. And yeah, as Johannes said, funding is not necessarily the issue, but attracting the correct funding is something that we actually need to deal with. We had a meeting this morning earlier with the British government as well, and one of the things that came through very specifically in that discussion is how do we as a country compete? How do we make sure that we attract investors? Because there's a lot of money that's looking for returns at this point in time, and if you look at the developed markets, they definitely are not in a space where the returns that they're getting is competitive. But at the end of the day, for an investor, there's two things that's important: risk and return. And if we look at some of our neighbors in the rest of the continent, they are doing really well on the risk side, on the return side. Maybe on the risk side, there are areas where maybe we doing a little bit better. But at the end of the day, it's risk versus return and what you could get from that. And that is really a conversation that we should have in South Africa. If I can just maybe take a little bit of a more general view about what are the key things that's driving the economic environment at the moment. PwC has defined what we call ADAPT. And you would have seen different versions of this in a lot of different places. But it just surprises me that, it's been a little bit more than a year. There's a book that's been published by one of my colleagues, Blair Shepherd, called 10 Years to Midnight, where he actually frames ADAPT. And very, very frankly, looking back at this, more than a year old, basically, in terms of its views, it is just as relevant, and that is the reason why we think that these are the mega trends that's shaping the environment in which we are at the moment. And to be very honest, COVID-19 just accelerated those. I'm just going to go through them very briefly. First of all, asymmetry, the gap between rich and poor, unemployment. Vishal mentioned the growing unemployment problem that we're sitting with in South Africa, and to be, again, a little bit, I don't want to say negative, but we are at this point in time the country with the highest level of unemployment globally. So it is really something that we need to need to address. And infrastructure and infrastructure investment is a key part of government's plans as part of doing that. But we're seeing that growing gap between rich and poor and rising unemployment, and it's really pertinent in our society. And unfortunately, a couple of months ago, we saw the impact of that with the unrest in KZN and in Gauteng. It doesn't matter, what you think are the reasons behind that, but the bottom line was that, as somebody's put it to me the one day, is that there was dry wood and there was a fire that was able to light that dry wood. Then secondly, disruption, technology, and then the other one that we've also spoken about a little bit this morning, people becoming more socially and environmentally conscious and aware of what is happening in society and environment and the environment, and investors are asking questions. And that is, again, creating some unique challenges for South Africa, unique opportunities as well. We have an environment and a country that is really well positioned to be very competitive in the renewable energy space, but we are also very well endowed in terms of our coal resources. So how do we move away from those into other areas? Just transition has become a buzzword. How do we actually make sure that the transitioning of the economy into other spaces makes sense? And Johan spoke about funding. How do we also fund that transition? So both the new technologies that we can invest in and new areas of investment, but also the transitioning away from the traditional sources of energy, for example, or if we look at vehicle manufacturing as an example, how do we actually transition away from that? Then age, growing unemployment amongst those people that are part of the younger population. And that is a challenge that we need to actually deal with in South Africa. The World Bank economists actually refer to it as the the age dividend, and the fact that we're the population dividend, that we have a young population, but it also creates some challenges for us. Then polarization, continued focus on localization, countries looking after themselves, etc. What does that mean for attracting investors in future? How does it look like, and what does it mean for ourselves? And then lastly, trust in institutions. And I'm not going to say a lot about that, but it's a trust in public institutions, but also businesses. And that is going through a really difficult time here in South Africa as well as globally. What is on this slide? Just very quickly, an overview of some key data that we've been trying to keep track of in the economy. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a lag with, for example, our GDP data. So we've been trying to keep tabs on some of the things as they come out and as they're published. And you will see a lot of green. And that is good news, because it means that there is, we are going through a process of actually improving our economic growth through a rebuild. But you will also see some very strange data there. It's comparing against the same month last year when we were in a complete lockdown. For example, in April, if you look at tourist accommodation, when we basically didn't have any tourism. It looks like there's been a 300% increase, or more than a 300% increase in activity. And I think whatever we look at, we should just keep in mind the base that we're coming from. And the fact that a year ago there were certain parts of the economy that were all but locked down completely. So what I'm keeping an eye out for is actually numbers that start to come through from August, as we know that the economy started to open up by then, and what has happened there, and that will show us really some trends about where we're going. What I also thought about sharing with you is, we've been having a conversation, and government has been focusing quite heavily on the role that infrastructure can play in the rebuild of the economy. And whilst this is true, the fact of the matter is that we are in fact spending less money. If you look at just purely what was in the budget last year versus what was in the budget at the beginning of this year. And yes, that will probably change if we get into October, but be that as it may, there are certain parts of infrastructure spending that's gone backwards, and then there's others where we are in fact spending more. But the bottom line is we have to be a lot more innovative with where our money goes and what that infrastructure investment means, and the prioritization thereof in areas that actually makes economic sense and makes socioeconomic sense. And I think what Johan has alluded to is that we really need private sector to get involved, because from a government perspective, there's pressure on the funding, and we will have to think about new ways, in fact, to get the private sector involved in providing funding, because from a government perspective, the funding sources are limited and under pressure. If you look at building confidence, the building confidence index that's published by the BER, unfortunately, we're still at a point where about 65% of survey respondents are dissatisfied with the prevailing business conditions. So if you look at 50 kind of being the midpoint, where around half of respondents are satisfied and half are dissatisfied. Unfortunately, our long-term average has been below that as a country, and with a lot of respondents looking at the infrastructure and building sector, not yet positive about where it's going. But I think the good news is that there's been a significant improvement in terms of where we were. If you look at June last year, or even a couple of years before that. Some of the things that have been raised as key challenges in the industry, weak contractor activity, pressure on overall profitability, delays on municipal approval of projects, the construction mafia, and I think there's a few of you that have been actually, or that can speak of having experienced that. Government inaction regarding the rollout of key building projects, and worse than expected domestic demand for building materials. So all of that playing a role in the industry. On the job side, how's the construction sector doing? Well, some positive news there, but unfortunately, overall, as an economy, we are in a worse position job-wise. So as economists, we are saying that we are seeing growth. We've heard that in the first and the second quarter of this year, we've seen some growth. And in fact, there are the Reserve Bank, for example, that is expecting growth in excess of 5%. But we're not seeing the concurrent creation of jobs in conjunction with that. And there's a lot of questions as to why that is happening, because I will show you later, we found that GDP growth, or GDP, is one of the major factors that actually leads to employment growth, but there's 1/3 of other factors that is in fact contributing to that, and we think that uncertainty at this point in time is reflecting or impacting negatively in companies' decisions to create jobs. But on the positive side, construction has been one of the sectors where there's been a bit of job growth, and in fact, between trade and construction, they were the biggest winners in terms of job creation between Q1 and Q2. But overall, unfortunately, we've in fact lost jobs between the first and the second quarter of this year, in spite of the fact that the economy has been growing. I don't want to focus on this too much, but what I also just wanted to show you is where is construction jobs if compared to the pre-COVID period. So we're back to about 90% of the jobs that we had in the construction sector pre-COVID, but there's still some room for improvement. Certain parts of the economy doing better, and other parts such as manufacturing being under quite a bit of pressure. What do we see in terms of economic recovery? I must say that we are, as PwC, one of the forecasters out there that's a little bit more conservative. So as I said, the Reserve Bank actually expecting growth of over 5%. We're currently at around a 3% mark. We are going through a process of actually just aligning our modeling and everything to the rebalancing of the GDP numbers that CESA has published. But the bottom line is that we still expect around 2 to 3 years for us to get back to the pre-COVID scenario in terms of growth. So only probably towards the middle of next year or the beginning of 2030 will we be back where we were before COVID. And if you look at labor jobs, I don't want to go into this into too much detail, but the bottom line is we are not at all creating jobs as fast as we should. We did some research where we looked at sectors, key sectors that would in fact play a role in terms of job creation. And no surprises there. Construction was definitely amongst one of the top sectors that has the potential of job creation. Another one, unfortunately, that's been through a lot is the tourism sector. So as an economy, we really need to rely on some of these other sectors like construction, like the retail sector, specifically if we look at the export of products to create job opportunities for us. And what I just wanted to show you here is basically that what we've seen is that about 2/3 of the movement in the jobs market is created by GDP, and 1/3 is other factors that's in fact playing a role at this point in time. And unfortunately, it seems that these other factors and uncertainty around the other factors is more important. Things like vaccine delays and lockdowns and the social unrest that we've seen. And then a big one is the availability of electricity and electricity supply. In fact, we believe that that is one of the major things that we need to fix to get the economy going. And that creates both opportunities for the infrastructure sector, but it's also an input that is required and that is really necessary for other types of infrastructure projects. So this is really one of the areas, if I had to say, fix 2 things in the economy, well, 3, that's the most important, it is fixing our electricity supply, getting our skills sorted out, and making sure that we get private sector investment going. With this slide, just very quickly, an overview of have we seen the risk and return in certain sectors improving or not? And one of the sectors that have in fact improved slightly is infrastructure. It's interesting, another sector, for example, like banking and financial services that used to be a big focus for the South African economy and will continue to be probably, has unfortunately deteriorated. So if you look at the sectors that provide opportunity at the moment, these are the ones: auto production, oil and gas, medical devices, information technology and infrastructure, that is relatively better than what it was before COVID. And just to wrap up, what I mentioned in terms of where are the key areas that we think we need to move the needle and actually to change the economy is to look at the availability of energy supply, firstly. Secondly, improving our base of skills and knowledge capital, and then private sector investment being the third arm. So between these 2, I can basically say that infrastructure investment is a key part of both of these areas that we believe that is really necessary to improve the economy, to get that private sector investment going. We've seen all but an investment strike if you look at fixed capital investment, and that we really need. And the other area, of course, is to fix the availability of energy supply. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop there, and inshallah, I assume we will take some questions later.
Yes, thank you. That was a very insightful presentation, and I think it just reinforces the discussion that the topic of the hour, which is the need for investment into infrastructure and development. Lulu, we'll take a Q&A session at the end, but just one question that has come up: the impact of the global credit ratings of South Africa or the economy or the downgrade that happened just before the pandemic. What has been the feedback over the last year and a half from the global credit rating agencies, and how does that affect the ability for South Africa to attract private investment into infrastructure and other associated industries?
Very honest, it has, or if you look at the cost of lending, it shot up at the start of COVID and then stabilized. But it is still significantly more expensive for South Africa to get access to funding if we look at how we are viewed by the credit rating agencies. But the important factor remains, if you look at the developed markets, they basically are in a position where they have almost zero returns on investment. So whenever investors look at markets, what they look at is risk versus return. And if we can get the return bit right, I still believe that on the risk side, yes, our risks have improved, have gotten worse, but so has everybody else's, to be quite honest, in the situation where we are. So if we can get the return side right, we will still attract more than enough investment. And in fact, we might attract investors that weren't maybe previously looking at South Africa as a market. So yes, it has gotten more expensive. We can't ignore it. And yes, the rating agencies are looking at what we're doing. Some of them have us on negative outlook, so it means that our credit ratings can get even worse, which means that access to funding is becoming more expensive. But on the positive side, we've seen for the first time in many, many years that government has in fact improved their forecast in terms of GDP and debt levels, and how quickly we can pay it back in tax collections. I think it's the first time in 6 or 7 years, and we expect the same now when we look at the mini budget or the October budget. So that will be a good signal. At the end of the day, it's about returns. There's a lot of other countries in the same risk basket than we are.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lulu. Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Okay, our final speaker for this morning is Mr. Engelbert Beneda. Engelbert is the Chief Operating Officer of GrowthPoint Management Services, a wholly owned subsidiary of GrowthPoint Properties Limited. He has 24 years experience in property management, fund and asset management. GrowthPoint is regarded as the leader in sustainability in the built SA environment with a proven track record. The current strategy is to achieve 20 net zero buildings, megawatts of solar energy, 20 million rand worth of green lease recoveries, and 1 commercially implemented Greenovate Award innovation in the full year. Engelbert holds a master's degree in business leadership and has completed executive courses at Gibbs and Harvard. Engelbert, over to you for your presentation.
Vishal, thank you very much. Very much like Lulu, I'm just going to attempt sharing my presentation. And if you'll just give me a moment. I'd just like to give some perspective on my presentation, where we are property owners and developers, not developers per se, but we are probably the end users of a lot of the infrastructure programs that's been talked about today. Okay, so as I was saying, we really are the end users. I found the discussions that we've just listened to fascinating and getting different perspectives there. Just for interest's sake, this particular cover slide of mine actually reflects the Discovery building that we built here in Sandton, and the area to the top right is an area which we wanted to develop as Sandton Summit, and there are 2 reasons why it hasn't happened. The one is the absolutely exorbitant bulk contributions that need to be paid, which we as a company personally want to take responsible for and actually do the infrastructure. And then sadly, we actually don't have tenants for this space, which then talks to some of the factors that Lulu has mentioned. We're very much a South African company. I can walk into any presentation like this and I can bemoan corruption and unemployment and everything else that is negative. And yet we are still very much a South African company. We've got 65 billion rands worth of assets in South Africa. We've got, call it 420 odd properties across different geographic nodes. We the proud owners of 5.3 million square meters. And yet we've almost got 40% of our assets by book value is offshore, but only 29% of our income comes from there. And then we've also got assets under management where we've got investments in Langa, which is Africa Fund, and then a Growth Point Holdings, healthcare property holdings funds, which we launched about 2 years ago, where we've either acquired hospitals or we've physically developed hospitals. And then we've recently launched a third fund, which is going to be focusing on student accommodation, where we've bought ready-made buildings, but we've also decided to build. And in fact, we're kickstarting the development of 3 others. So the reality is we're South African based. And to us, it's a question of how do we survive this and what do we do? So just as Growth Point, and I just had a quick look at the numbers yesterday, we paid rates and taxes to local authorities to the tune of 1.2 billion rand. Electricity, 1.4 billion rand. In order to do that, almost 7,000 meters need to be read on a monthly basis. We pay 128 million rand in water per annum, 5,300 odd meters that need to be read. And then in addition to that, we pay CID levies of 5 million rand. We create 11,000 megawatt hours of solar energy, and that's growing. Our target is to get that up to 20 megawatts. Generator costs, just to keep our buildings running, costing us 25 million rand a year. And we've had to sink 77 boreholes where we haven't had enough water to service our particular properties. And then we've had to make a 7-year commitment to our insurers to upgrade water tanks at a lot of our properties where the water pressure as provided by the council is just insufficient. So as a REIT, which is a listed company, amongst others, you've got your audit committees, your risk committees, etc. But a specific committee that is required is this a risk committee that some of those. She mentioned the poor business confidence, hence our Sandton Summit development not having kicked up. And then you can add on a plethora of other risks. If it's not COVID, it's Eskom. If it's not Eskom, it's looting. It's the lack of skills, people immigrating, people semigrating to other areas. The concerns and the risks are just becoming increasingly more difficult. So where does that leave us as a company? The cost of occupancy is impacting our rentals across all our sectors as a result of increased administered costs. So tenants can only pay so much. If you can only afford 100 rand a square meter, and 60 rand of that is being chewed up by administered costs, be it rates and taxes, be it CID levies, etc. As a property owner and a property developer, it makes it extremely difficult to make deals possible. Clearly, a lot of people attending this Indaba are in that space where they want to be involved with developments and they want to provide products for those developments. This is the real challenge that property owners are faced with.
Apologies, Mr. Benedal. It's Lolo. We had lost you for a brief moment there. I think it was due to connectivity and we no longer see your slides. If I could ask for you to please reshare.
Okay. My apologies. Lolo, can you just tell me up to which slide you had seen?
I believe we had just started with our commitment. If perhaps we could take it from
there?
Yes, please.
Did I actually complete this particular commentary? Okay, just very briefly. You can see what we pay. We are not in arrears. we're a good corporate citizen, and we're paying our local authorities, and we're paying for our consumption that we use on our properties. And in addition to that, we are clearly paying CID levies. We're creating our own solar, which we're jacking up to 20 megawatts. I think recent legislation is going to allow us to even push that up further. We have to provide generators, boreholes, and as I said, we're spending 20 million rand per annum to upgrade water tanks due to lack of water pressure. To be a REIT, you have to have a risk committee. A risk committee is there to monitor risk and the continued survival of that particular company. And as I said, Lulu has mentioned macro, micro, economic difficulties or the fundamentals that are poor. Obviously, they're very poor business confidence. And then you can add a plenitude of other risks. If it's not looting, if it's not Eskom, if it's not a skill shortage, there is just so many. But the one that is facing growth point, and I think a lot of the other property owners in particular, is that the administered cost is just eating away at our feasibility rentals. So if somebody can only afford 100 Rand a square meter, and 60% of that goes to rates and taxes, CID levies, and other administered costs, it makes the feasibility for new developments almost impossible. I think if you could have heard me, I think a lot of people attending this in Indaba are people that are in the construction industry that would like to see it flourish, and we would like to see a lot more employment created over here. But if you don't get bang for the buck that you are paying, it clearly is going to make it extremely difficult for us. So just our outlook in a nutshell, I think infrastructure to a very large extent has failed already, but there are pockets of excellence. There's certain geographic nodes, certain towns, you just get a good feel when you drive through those towns. You can see things are working, and you can see that is where investment is flowing towards. From a growth point perspective, developments are on hold, and for a number of reasons. There aren't tenants. The economy is such a poor shape, and there's been such a big overhang of developed space that our developments are really on hold unless it's a slam dunk deal with a client, or as I say, in the hospital space or in the student resi space. And we're certainly trying to maintain what we have at this point in time. And then we've disinvested in nodes where we've had problems with infrastructure. It's unfortunate. Where we own properties in those areas, we found it just impossible to manage those properties, and the cost of occupation became increasingly more expensive, and we've simply disinvested, which is sad. And then we're taking responsibility for our own sustainability by ways of water reticulation, in terms of solar. Unfortunately, today, if you want to play in the schoolyard in South Africa, you have to take responsibility for your own sustainability. And then we would like to engage even more with local authorities and those people that are responsible for infrastructure. Working together, we can actually make a difference. We've reached out because our skills are available. But it seems to be a very one-way conversation, which is slightly disappointing. And yet, and then the final comment is that we still remain optimistic. I think Lulu's slide, which said was a lot more green, is because we came off a very low base. The economic growth is there. South Africans are resilient. South African companies are resilient. We tend to forget what happened 3 months ago, and we stand up on the ashes. And because we're coming from a low base, we believe that there are still fantastic opportunities going forward. I thank you.
Thank you, Engelbert, giving us an overview of Growthpoint's views and perspectives on the economy and where we are. I think a lot of people share the optimism that you have to be optimistic about the future and seek to create the future that we would like to see. Perhaps I can just ask you a general question. You've mentioned some of the challenges that you are facing, which have led to the putting on hold the new developments and so on that you might have had in the planning. Outside of general economic growth, what changes would Growthpoint want to see or would like to see in the local environment, whether it be regulatory, legislative, or other, that would then increase the appetite, the risk appetite from Growthpoint perspective to start developing and investing on that level?
Yeah. So I think the formal answer is that we, through bodies like SAPOA, South African Property Owners Association, our lobbying government, in terms of legislation, and sometimes our things get pushed through and our things could be speeded up and made it easy for somebody to invest. I think the Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce and Industry has also been lobbying the property industry to find out how they can be of more assistance. Once again, certain geographic nodes are easier to deal with and things get done a lot quicker and smoother because I think they appreciate the investment that comes their way. As a company, a couple of things need to happen. I think we need to get herd community. We need to kind of try and put COVID behind us. I think once we've done that, we'll be able to have these conferences in person, which I think is a lot more pleasurable. And there's immediate spin-off, from having a conference in person, to the neighboring properties and conference facilities. We are part owner of the V&A waterfront in Cape Town. COVID hit. Overnight, it went from one of our star performers to a ghost town. And a lot of that is dependent on particularly UK travel, which we're still on the red list. That needs to be dealt with. The conference facilities at Cape Town Convention Centre was open. That would certainly help as well. We need people back at offices. I think there's been a huge overhang in developed office space. Vacancies are at an all-time high, very concerning. But I think if the economy is going to be growing at the rates that is projected, I think you'll see a slow take-up of that space. But certainly the construction industries had to reset, and property developers have to reset their thinking in terms of when to trigger a development or not.
Okay. Engelbert, thank you for that. And I think we all are optimistically hoping for stronger growth, stronger fundamentals, and better partnering amongst the entire ecosystem around infrastructure development so that we get more projects through quicker and shovels in the ground faster. That, I think, is our collective hope. If I can invite Lulu just to join us again so we can close off this session with a bit of a Q&A. The chat box is open to any participants to ask any questions for the panelists. A question which has been asked, Lulu, which perhaps Engelbert you could also comment on. Lulu, the question is, what effect will the work from home or hybrid work model and the many buildings which are not fully utilized have on the construction industry? And there seems to be a strong trend now on companies sort of refurbishing existing space or downscaling as opposed to rebuilding or taking up new office space. Lulu, to you firstly, that question.
Vishal, I think, unfortunately, as Engelbert has said, we are not out of the woods and we haven't figured out how things would look like. I think the good news is that people are slowly but surely returning to offices. But everywhere, it's a hybrid model. From what I've picked up in other parts of the world, in South Africa, the big companies, I'm in the PwC building today, that big building in Waterfall. But I can tell you that the building is not as full as it normally is. There's COVID regulation, and that the fact that, that most companies have said, and most people have said, we want to have a hybrid model. We want to be able to work from home some days, and we want to be able to come into the office on others. So that definitely will have an impact As Engelbert has said, there is capacity that's already been developed before COVID, and that will kind of have to work out of the system as well. The good news is, as I said, I think we are going back to the office to some extent, and especially the larger firms. Here in South Africa and in the rest of the world, I've seen that there's a some degree of returning to offices and that we have to see each other. But I don't know if it will ever go back to what we've seen before. And it looks unlikely at this point in time that we will have people spending 5 days a week in the office.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lulu. Engelbert, just to you, same question, slightly different angle. As a property owner, you would have had to consider rental relief and the like in the course of 2020, perhaps still in 2021, and would have had to provision for that, on an annual basis. What has the impact of that been on your ability or on your redistribution of funds that you would have set aside for investments and so on? And how do you see that moving forward? Are you still in that situation, or is that beginning to stabilize a bit?
So to give you a sense, I think we've just released our annual results, and our arrears at this year end, I think, amounted to 300 million rand. Whereas at the worst it's ever been prior to that was 100 million rand. Just as COVID hit, I think the small moms and pop shops, the people that were selling coffee or cutting hair, those people were worst hits. And I think our arrears peaked at almost 600 million rand. I believe the number that we gave as discounts was in the order of 360 million rand, and it's still growing. And I think at the waterfront in Cape Town, 300 million rands worth of discounts were given. That is literally where you've said, don't pay, survive, see what you can do, because we'd like you back when things look up. And the deferments we gave were in the order of about 450 million rand, if I'm not mistaken, where people had a payment plan to come back. And we slowly chipped away at that. And I think, who do you give the discounts to, or who do you give the deferments to? Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. So it's been a long, hard process. So that's the answer to that. And just back to the future of the office, I agree wholeheartedly. It will never be the same again. As a property owner, we would like to see as many people back as possible. The reality, a lot of people can do their jobs from home and prefer to do it from home. But unfortunately, some people, the job entails them to collaborate and with other staff members, and those people certainly have a longing to come back to the office. We've also found, and I can speak for Growth Point, that the number of people with stress-related concerns and depression has picked up significantly because of this very strange, difficult environment. And very often your office is that family away from home. So that collaboration is very important. And then I also think you mustn't mistake, I suppose it talks to the injustices of the past. Not everybody can afford a house, 3 bedrooms with a garden where you can take a break when you're tired. But if you're stuck in a 1 bedroom flat on the 3rd floor and you have to eat, sleep and work in the same space, it just is not conducive for good mental health and certainly for productivity. And those people, I think, have a wish and a longing to come back to the office. But you're going to have to change the office. It's going to have to be better space, nicer space, more entertaining space for people to want to come back.
Yeah, thanks, Engelbert. That actually touches on the next question I was going to ask from the floor. And the question was, will the change in occupancy requirements change the specification of buildings to be more competitive, meaning more technology and connectivity focused and adaptability for reuse? Is that what Growth Point's beginning to see as future developments, that the specifications would need to change along those lines? I think you've almost touched on that in your earlier comment.
Yeah, I think in fairness, everybody's asking, we're converting all our office space to residential. The reality is there's only a handful of properties that you can actually do that, and it works for those properties. The others are commercial properties as we know it, and it'll have to remain that way. I don't think any developer willingly goes in and builds a brand new 10,000 square meter head office for somebody, and then wishing, or with a concern that after 5 years that they're going to have to convert it to residential. So as far as environmentally friendly buildings goes and incorporating IT infrastructure, that's a definite yes. Those will always be in, but you're not going to build a building that's got multiple uses. It doesn't make sense, with all due respect.
Understood. And I think the last question, we're almost out of time. Lulu, this is to you. Question reads like this: South Africa is a very innovative nation. What are the chances of an industry built around innovation turning things around? Example, tech startups.
I think you are, well, and whoever made that comment, and that comment came out earlier when Engelbert spoke as well. We are an innovative nation. We are a nation that finds solutions for challenges, and we seem to be able to get back to our feet. I think what we've seen, what is interesting for me, is that the massive speed and rate at which we were able to move onto new platforms, technologies, do things, etc. I heard one of the technology platform CEOs speak the other day, one of the big telcos companies, and his feedback was that COVID probably moved us about 5 years ahead in terms of the uptake of technology and how quickly we were able to do things. So I think that is a key area for South Africa in terms of focus, growth, investment. But the challenge that we are is, if you look at certain things like our natural resources, the weather, etc., where those are needed, investors will come for those. When we look at technology, a company can basically be everywhere. So the question is, how do we sure that we are competitive and that we attract investors in that space? I think we've seen some very interesting moves, specifically in the financial services industry, given the the developments or the level of development that we have in the financial services industry. We also by far have the most diversified economy on the continent, so I think that could also serve us in good stead. But what we just need to take a step back is to say, okay, we have a lot of stuff that is actually working for us, but how do we make sure that we are competitive in those spaces where companies can basically go everywhere or anywhere? How do we make sure that we are an attractive investor or investment destination, if we look at that?
All right. I'd like to thank Engelbert and Lulu for your contributions this morning and this afternoon to the Indaba. I think it's been an invaluable session of educating our members who have joined the session. And I think through the presentations this session, there's been a strong reinforcement that there are opportunities for infrastructure investment locally. There is financing available. It's a question of just getting projects that are bankable on the table and that we can actually sell, and we can actually start getting shovels in the ground. Ultimately, that's what it's about. Get shovels in the ground, generate employment, and let infrastructure play the catalytic role that it can, and that will help move the economy forward. That's it from us. Thank you, everyone. We will now break from 1:30 till 2:30 for the next session. And I thank you all for your time and your participation. And I hand you back to the organizers. Thank you, everyone.